Hey everyone, just wanted to check in talking about week 3 of interpersonal relationships, which, in my opinion, is the most interesting of all the chapters in that we start hearing about your boyfriends and girlfriends and past relationships and the way that you communicate on the phone. So we have a lot of self-disclosure, which is it's not a bad thing. And if you did provide some of that disclosure, thank you for that. But there are a few items that I thought were interesting enough to talk about via video and headset. In particular, some ideas that maybe face-to-face relationships are better than online relationships. And of course, we have the Walther article, and we look at the hyper-personal communication model. But there were some comments that I thought were interesting. First of which is that there was this question, and I pull it up right here. Do you think that there were similar issues when the telephone became a common household item? And that's in reference to using the smartphone as being a distraction. And the answer is a definitive yes. Absolutely. And the reason why the smartphone and the regular home phone are very similar in a lot of ways, of course there are a plethora of differences, is that they were new innovative technologies that people started to adapt to, right? So it's not as though people received the cell phone and then it was just so uniquely different that everything that they knew about the world had changed. Instead, it took a while for people to actually become diffused to the innovations that were there. Okay, so keep in mind, as we're talking about communication technologies, we're not talking about, okay, technology is invented, everyone has it, and now here we are. No, it's actually a process, right? Technology is invented, the iPhone comes out, people are a little bit hesitant because BlackBerry was the biggest competitor, and then over time we have HTC and we have all these other computers inside phones that we are slowly starting to adopt ourselves, okay? So it's this gradual process. Just like the home phone, people had the home phone for a while, and then other people had the home phone, and then we started to communicate. I do remember a day and time where we actually had to remember other people's phone numbers. I know that seems like a very far away time. The only reason I remember my fiance's number, truth be told, is it's the router password, so for Wi-Fi. But I don't know if that is portraying me in a positive or negative light. There is this idea, though, that people are a little bit hesitant to acknowledge that computer-mediated communication, or these communication technologies, allow us to facilitate or actually be a part of interpersonal relationships that are very satisfying, or at least more so satisfying than face-to-face relationships. And to that I say, it depends, right? A lot of us, from what I'm understanding, have engaged in a lot of face-to-face interactions because that makes sense. You live in a community, you go to a specific high school, you have all these friends that you talk to every day face-to-face. There are a lot of references of MySpace and Facebook and other social media networking sites that we use to help really supplement our pre-existing relationships. But I will say, a lot of us, as it seems, have not really engaged in an exclusively online relationship with a person. I'm not talking just about playing World of Warcraft online or meeting people across the country via Match.com, but instead just casual relationships that emerge from the internet, and that the physical proximity to the person is not necessarily the biggest deterrence in that relationship. There were a couple of comments in regard to interpersonal relationships, even romantic relationships, where these communication technologies seem to be a deterrent. Okay, for instance, the Duran article talks about the possible distractions that people face when being in a relationship, and how that phone, or the smartphone, or whatever the communication technology is, starts to impede the process of the relationship. Some of us, if we look at it from a relational dialectics perspective, the openness and closeness within the relationship starts to change because these social media websites, the interactions that we have with people, the snaps, the tweets, okay, all of that starts to really mitigate what insider knowledge that we have. So think about it 10 years ago, maybe even 15 years ago, when you had an experience, the only people that likely knew about the experience were your friends, your family, the close people that you decided to tell. Now, if 3 or 4 people removed actually knew about it, it might have been word of mouth, you might have told someone who told someone. Now, the way that we actually communicate and the way that our interpersonal relationships are shaped and occur, we tweet, we put it on Instagram, and we actually can share with one social media website. So for instance, posting something on Instagram, we can post it to Facebook, we can post it to Twitter. I'm sure there are a lot of other things that I'm missing out on, but those are the two that I'm most familiar with. And we use that as a tool to share information. So the innovation of this technology actually allows us to have experience, to have exposure to a number of different people with one point and one click. Okay, so it's very different than the way that we saw the world before, and it's not necessarily a good thing or necessarily a bad thing, but instead it is different. Okay, and when we're talking about these distinctions, the McEwen article mentions ideas such as when online meets offline, that there are distinctions such as facial expression, tone of voice, emotions, and we have that all over. Right? We have the integration now of nonverbal cues and verbal cues within these communication technologies. Emojis start to capture a variety of different emotions in a lot of instances, or things that are even representative, are symbolic of other things. For instance, instead of saying that we went to the zoo, we can send someone a text message that has 14 little emojis of zoo animals, and for our purposes, that is the exact same conveying of meaning. And at the same time, if we're talking about emotion and the affect that's experienced, with cell phones and with modern technology, we can actually convey meaning. We can convey this notion that I am upset by sending you a small emoji with a very upset face, or I am happy with a emoji with giant teeth, very excited, very happy. Okay, so it's not as though the communication technologies that we use today are completely absent of these nonverbal cues or the symbolism, but instead it is simply different than what we are accustomed to in these face-to-face interactions. Okay, but at the same time, before we get too heavily into the criticisms, we know face-to-face that we can actually mask certain emotions in our interpersonal relationships. Okay, so if I'm upset with you, yes, to some degree it is easy to hide that via social media or via communication technologies, because I have strictly text to go off of, or emojis that can be used to maybe display an emotion that I'm actually not feeling. But as we know, some people can actually do that face to face. They're really good liars, people who are really good at self-monitoring, controlling emotions, can actually do that face to face. So I don't think it is a strictly communication technologies issue, but instead those issues exist both face to face and online. Okay, so the research about interpersonal communication, interpersonal relationships is very interesting, because so frequently we put the dynamic as here's face-to-face relationships, here's computer-mediated communication relationships, and then there's this very big divide. Instead, what I would argue is that these are more like a Venn diagram, in that the face-to-face has a lot of unique characteristics and qualities, whereas the computer-mediated, or even the mediated communication, has, again, unique qualities, but together there is a lot of overlap. There's a lot of meaning that's being conveyed and messages that are being shared. And ultimately, I find it very interesting that we very quickly will be able to say, okay, you know what, this particular technology makes it harder than face-to-face. Okay, because if we're thinking going back to this hyperpersonal model of communication, the dynamic feedback loop between a sender and receiver, okay, we have that face-to-face. In the most basic communication courses, we talk about typically an interactive communication model where there are two people or two interactants who are sending messages back and forth. Well, in the hyperpersonal model, it really isn't different. Some of the differing qualities, but again, are present in face-to-face, are these ideas of self-presentation being strategic in a sense. Okay. Similarly, we have this idealized perception. Naturally, I seem to find that at this point in the course, someone will inevitably mention Catfish, which is fine. I've watched every episode of Catfish. I've seen the movie. I'm very much so caught up. I've read tons of papers about Catfish, so I am the Catfish expert behind Neve, I suppose. This idealized perception, again, yes, it is easy to experience this online. Of course. Of course, we can see someone on a dating website or a social networking website and go, man, if only I had the opportunity to be with him or her. I get that. But is it really that different than what we do face to face, or just in our traditional interpersonal relationships? And I would argue no. Instead, we have different tools to facilitate the way that we have these self-presentations being strategic and the feedback loop between people. Okay, so again, I don't think they're exclusive to face-to-face or mediated, but instead they happen on both ends of that spectrum, and that we need to be cognizant of that. And one final comment, just based on some of the the discussions that we were having, there was one particular thread that was talking about dating and online dating websites, and I myself, for very short stints, was on an online dating website, OkCupid, which was actually the example. And I will say, just like going to a specific bar or meeting with specific types of people, there is a perception that is held with specific dating websites, like there is with going out with specific types of people. For instance, Match.com is regarded in a lot of ways as really facilitating or providing people who are more interested in the romantic relational component, whereas let's say OkCupid, Plenty of Fish, are more so the hookup dating websites. Okay, so again, perception plays a pretty integral role in the way that we talk about these. And I'm not saying that if you think OkCupid is for your next husband or wife or spouse, versus saying that it is for strictly hooking up, but instead what I am suggesting is that, like all the things we'll talk about in this course, and we have talked about, the perceptions that we have, okay, oftentimes leak into the way that we think about these dating websites, right? So if you yourself have never had a Skype interaction with someone, of course your perception, your ideology of that will be very different than someone who has a Skype conversation with their significant other who's 4,000 miles away every night. Okay, so again, this is our frame of reference. We just need to make sure that our frame of reference isn't really diluting or clouding our judgment here. Okay, so at the end of the day, we just need to make sure that we're being aware that we are saying certain comments based on our personal experiences and our thought process, and they don't necessarily have to be right or wrong or indifferent, but instead that our interpersonal relationships, the way that we perceive them, the way that we approach them, are different and they're unique. And sometimes that's good, sometimes that's bad, but let's just be cognizant of that as we're sort of moving forward. If you have any questions about the interpersonal chapter, let me know. Otherwise, really good job talking about all of this content. Moving forward, we go into the last section of Unit 1, which is impression management. And in a lot of ways, as we're talking about the hyperpersonal model, we can see that the notion of the self-presentation really controlling the perceptions of people is going to become more prominent within this chapter of impression management. And I believe, the hyperpersonal theory will be a pretty integral part of what we talk about. So if you had any questions or struggled with understanding the hyperpersonal model or what Walter was getting at, please let me know so we can clarify before we move into impression management. Otherwise, I look forward to hearing some of our conversations and talking to you soon. All right, team.